So shall we begin? Thank you for coming tonight. We'll begin as we always do with a prayer to the Holy Spirit. Source of faith and love for us, for the gift of wisdom, to understand these mysteries. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful. Kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created. You shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. Father, you instruct the hearts of your faithful people by the light of the Holy Spirit. Grant us in that same Spirit to savor what is right, always to rejoice in his consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now these courses and these classes are meant to be kind of contained within themselves so that you can follow along, even if not perfectly, coming to each one. There are a couple of you here tonight who are here for the first time. So, we in the first class, we kind of looked at some of the fairly dry landmarks in traditional catechetical, conciliar, theological training, teaching on faith. But last week we looked at James Scholars, Methodist minister and teacher, stages of faith. So even though he's a Methodist minister, he was approaching faith from the point of view of developmental psychology, and I think those of you who are here appreciated his perspective. I certainly did when it first came out in the 1980s, and it's been a landmark for me. It did a couple of things. A, it put the phenomenon of faith as a human phenomenon, not just a religious phenomenon. And it showed how faith grows, how there are stages of faith precisely. That there are critical stages, critical thresholds that you pass, often tied up with your own psychological human development. So it's to be expected that faith is an ongoing journey. Now, what we're going to do tonight, looking at Catholics, we're looking at some Catholic testimony, both mystical and theological, who will kind of give substance and proof, will be a certification and an instantiation and a validation of what Fowler was saying. So we're coming back to a exclusively religious context now, but approaching it also, as I say, from a mystical and a theological point of view, looking at two major figures and a couple of other ones on the outskirts, a few other ones to confirm and illustrate what we're trying to say. So we're going to be looking at John of the Cross and his vision of faith in the mystical life. And we'll be looking at Karl Rahner, the great Jesuit theologian of the 20th century, and his vision of humanity and the journey of faith. And we'll see how these, if anything, confirm and lend flesh to what we saw last week, and in terms of faith as a journey. A little appetizer, though, a little amuse-bouche, as they say in French, to start with, although it's much more than that. It's a couple of stanzas of the Hymn of St Ambrose from the late 4th century, Splendor Pateni Gloria and Splendor of Eternal Father. It's close to my heart because this was the hymn that we sang every day. There was not a major feast, every day at the beginning of morning prayer. And so more or less 2 a.m. in the choir and church, we'd be singing this hymn every night, so we're at the beginning of every day. It resonates with me, and I thought I'd just share these last 3 stanzas with you, particularly what they have to say about faith. You see already that in this 4th century and the great mystics that the fathers of the church were, I use that appetizer, how tasty faith is, how intoxicating faith is, as we'll see. So I'll just share this with you. Speaking about the day that we're about to start, Me Christusque nobis sit cibus, potusque nostris sit fides, et leti bibam sobriam ebrietatem spiritus, which means, let Christ be our food today, and let faith be our drink. So faith is something you should be drinking. each day. And then, to continue that image, and may we joyfully drink the sober drunkenness of the Spirit. This is one of the very famous phrases from St Ambrose. So we got drunk every day at 2 a.m., not just in the bars of New York, but we got drunk 2 a.m. every morning on the Spirit, the sober drunkenness of the Spirit. So this was, visceral, this was intimate, this was primal, this was food and drink. This is what faith can and should be. And then the next to last stanza, Vetus Deus sic transeat quid orso tituluculum, fides velut meridies, crepusculum mens nesciat. So let this day pass joyfully. May modesty, be like the dawn. May faith be like midday. And may our mind not know dusk, not know twilight. So here's a vision of faith as pure midday light, which John of the Cross, by the way, will treat more of the light of eternity. But that's the hope, that faith will be bright and that we'll move toward the brightness of midday within faith. And then the final stanza, speaking of the dawn. So let dawn advance its chariot, let the true dawn come forth. And this is the feminine dawn, the word complete is masculine, so it refers to Christ as the dawn, the Son of God as the dawn. And then it completes with the entire Son is in the Father, and the entire Father is in the Son. So there again, we are like in the midday of eternity. So it's praying for light. What we're going to see today, and that part of what we saw last week, is that you got to pass through the dark before you get to the pure light of midday, the pure light of eternity, and that's what we're going to be talking about in great measure. Kind of justifying from a mystical and theological point of view that journey of faith through the darkness. In other words, doubt in that much, much broader sense. We're not talking about doubt so much or primarily as, gee, I'm not sure if that's true or not, I don't know whether God's really there. We're talking much more about existential doubt, passing through. Does anything mean anything? And what's the answer to that? If there is one. And we'll see that in coming weeks as well. So for John of the Cross, faith is what the journey is about. Faith is what silent prayer is about. Faith is what prayer is about. Faith is what the Christian life is about. In other words, as we've said already, is that entrusting yourself to the power of something greater than yourself, leaping forth into your life, particularly your life with God, but your life in general, as we'll see, with that openness and that surrender to the journey. So you're going to go through the journey of yourself, into the depths of yourself, and the journey into the depths of God. And since both of those depths, especially God, and in the end, they're intertwined, God's depths are the depths of your depths, as all the mystics say. If you go deep enough into yourself, you will encounter God and all of God's depths. We can interpret through the Spirit, as St. Paul says, who knows the depths of God except the Spirit of God. So in those depths, you're going to go through darkness, obviously. So as John of the Cross begins, his ascent of Mount Carmel with the famous poem, the first stanza. Here are with stanzas again. One dark night, I went out unseen. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, the sheer grace, there's love and grace involved here. I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled, so in the silence. And as he begins the commentary, one dark night, he says, there are 3 reasons for calling this journey toward union with God a night. The first has to do with the point of departure, because individuals must deprive themselves of their appetites for worldly possessions. This denial and privation is like a night for all one's senses. So he's going to go through, as you probably know, a description of the dark night of the senses, the first dark night of the mystical journey. And it's a night because we have to die to that level of perception. Human beings are incredibly attached. We cling to not just inordinate perceptions or pleasures or appetites, but pleasures and appetites at all. you know, our level of awareness and perception and judging reality and experiencing reality tends, first of all, to be the level of infants, really. What's this pleasure? What's that pleasure? What's the next thing I have to, you know, try and avoid or get? And so the first purification is to kind of get beyond that level of simply of sense perception and imagination, as he later says too, to something more. So that kind of purification of who we think we are, that kind of surrender and letting go of that level of consciousness is one of the things that makes faith dark. And that goes on then through the intellect as well, even concepts, not just the pleasures of the senses, but the pleasures of the mind. The securities of our conceptualizations of ourselves and of God, including and especially faith formulations, which are fine as far as they go, but they don't go very far because God is infinite mystery. So that's why it's dark, and that's why we have to kind of let go. We saw that in stage 4, for example, of the stages of faith last week, when you start, you know, to question, and when the symbol or the concept is not simply identical with or coterminous with the reality it points to, which is stage 3. So the second reason refers to the means or the road along which a person travels to this union. Now, this road is faith, and for the intellect, faith is also like a dark night. Why? Well, as traditional theology says, it's participation in God's own light and life and love. And that's way beyond our capacity to get right away. We have to be attuned to it, you know, branched into it, transformed into it. And faith is the way, that surrender in the dark. It doesn't become light. We have to get used to the dark, and we'll see the light through the dark if we go through the dark. And then especially, the third reason pertains to the point of arrival. So the point of departure, our own unruly and greedy little senses, the means or the road along the way, which is faith, and the point of arrival, number 3, namely God. And God is also a dark night to the soul in this life. Infinite light is like dark. Aristotle said the same thing. We can't see ultimate reality. We're like owl. We don't have the eyes. These 3 nights pass through a soul, or better, the soul passes through them in order to reach union with God. So the purifications in dark nights, you know, have to do with this fact that we're a mystery to ourselves. And above all, God is a mystery, which appears as darkness to us until we are transformed into it and can get used to God's light. But that's why faith is a dark journey. Not because we doubt or because it's imperfect, but because God is God. So we have to expect that. And part of the purification for the dark night of the senses is, I say, letting go of, you know, a certain superficial level of awareness and consciousness. But then also as a dark night of the spirit. Later on, the dark night of the soul, you know, you heard the expression, is on that higher level when you let go of the concepts and all the things you were clinging to on that level, both on the level of your understanding of God, concepts and formulas and all of that, who you thought God was. But also, I'm convinced, on the level of your understanding of yourself. And John of the Cross seems to present the dark night of the soul much more in moral terms, like you see yourself as so absolutely nothing and unworthy and all that stuff. So any kind of pretense you had of, oh, well, you know, I'm hot stuff, or I'm holy, or I'm pretty good, or I did my fasting on Friday and I went to Mass on Sunday, but that just gets blown right out of the water. Which, you know, shouldn't be such a surprise to us, but let's remember, especially by the 16th century, you know, Christian life is unfortunately seen much more in terms of moral perfection than mystical experience of God and His grace and mercy towards the unworthy. Even though it's clear in St. Paul, abundantly clear, and clear in the Gospel, the way Jesus treats people, He can't stand the holy people, and He loves the sinners. So why don't we get it? Because the ego wants to be in control and feel great about itself and you know, feel worthy, which is why we've got to go through the dark night of the spirit. And that's part. And also, I come to believe, all the archetypes we consider ourselves, we're a great priest, or we're a great lover, or we're a great father, or whatever way we define ourselves has to be smashed. And of course, anyway, we see God. So in other words, the map of the mystical journey by the clearest mystical doctor of the church outlines a lot of darkness and a lot of passages and a lot of transitions that confirm and give Catholic instantiation to what we saw last week in Vagueness. Now there are a couple of other quotes I wanted to share from John of the Cross in the context of the spiritual canticle. He quotes a lot, or refers a lot to the Song of Songs, as you might know, the Song of Solomon, in his own song, the spiritual canticle. And I liked this commentary. It says, "One of my eyes wounded you." The line in the Song of Songs says, "You ravished me with one of your eyes." That's what the Hebrew says. And it's the bridegroom talking to the bride, actually. Over here it seems to be, yes, it's the bridegroom saying, it's Christ saying to the soul, "Your eye wounded me." A modern translation has "a glance of your eyes wounded me." But the idea actually literally says, "Your eye wounded." So the purity of your gaze, the total trust and total simplicity, the poverty of spirit, whatever you want, the love as well, as he says, wounded spouse. So he says, in his commentary, the eye refers to faith. She says, the bride, she says she wounded him with only one eye, because if the soul's faith and fidelity towards God were not single, in other words, single-hearted, pure of heart, beatitude of pure of heart, who will see God, exactly, right? The mixture with some other human respect would not attain such an effect as to wound God with love. So thus it is only one eye that wounds the beloved. And then the wound of love is the result of the tenderest affection also. So that the love is a living faith, as we said, a faith working through love, as St. Paul says. Otherwise, it's not really trust or surrender. You have wounded me with my heart with one of your eyes. Interestingly, St. Bruno, the founder of my order, has a letter, one of the few writings we have from him, in which there's a phrase which is quoted in the statutes, the rule of my order, where it says, "Hic apiritur oculus ille, quo vulneratus sponsus amore, quo mundo puro conspicitur Deus," which means, here in solitude, in other words, in the monastery, is acquired that eye, singular, by which the spouse is wounded with love. Direct quote from the Song of Songs. This is we have in John of the Cross. And by which clean and pure God is seen. So that's a reference to the Beatitudes I just quoted too. The pure, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Grammatically, it can refer either to the love or to the eye. The eye is pure and clean and sees God, with the love. The spouse is wounded with love, which pure and clean and sees God. Interesting. But so that's that notion of the simplicity, the trust, the purity of the gaze of faith, which kind of lets go of everything else and simply gazes upon the beloved in trust, and that is what wounds the beloved's heart. So this is a love affair. It's not just the theological. It's not just some theological proposition here. The stanza I most remember about faith is it's a little more complicated, from Psalm 69, where it says, "O spring like crystal." She says faith is like crystal. Here we got the pure and clean, and for two reasons. First, because it concerns Christ, or bridegroom. Second, because it has the characteristics of crystal being pure in its truth, strong, clear, cleansed of errors and natural forms. So we're beyond the concepts. And then refers to the Samaritan woman, this crystal spring leading up to life eternal. Now, if only on your silvered over faces you would suddenly form the eyes I have desired. Now, this goes back to the idea that we have the very first class, in the very first example I gave. Remember that faith, according to Hebrews 11:1, is the substance of things hoped for. So the faith hopes for it, but the substance of it is already there. Or expressed differently, by the act of faith, which is already a gift of God, you surrender yourself and you already share God's life and love and light. It's already the beginning of the share in that. So what he's calling the silvered over faces are the formulations. But underneath that is the gold of the substance of faith, the actual life of God. So here's that theological proposition of what's included in the proposition is the very substance of what you hope for, expressed in poetic terms. As silvered over faces, and then the gold which is underneath. And as I say, it quotes Psalm 69 in obscure. I love this song because it's so obscure. I mean, I did a whole commentary on it when I was a monk. It's hard to translate too, but seems to be a mystical progression if you go back and read it. But it says, if you sleep between two choirs, or whatever the word means, so he says sleeping between earth and heaven, and sleeping is faith because your eyes are shut to everything else, and you're trouble where you're going. He calls faith the dove, and its feathers, the truths, it tells us, are silvery, because in this life faith proposes these truths to us covered and in darkness. In other words, through concepts. Through a glass darkly, as St. Paul says. As a result, she calls these truths silvered over faces. Yet, when faith comes to an end, as the same chapter 13 in Corinthians says it eventually will, when it terminates with a clear vision of God, the substance of faith, he says, having been stripped of the veil of silver, will have the color of gold. Let dawn be like faith, let faith be like midday. Dawn become bright. So then he says, so you already have the gold, really. You just don't really see it yet, and you haven't gone through the necessary stages to actually experience the gold. It's not just later after this life. Because he says, were someone to give us a gold vase plated with silver, we would not fail to receive a gold vase, merely because of its silver plated. So we might see just the formulas of faith, but if we're really living the life of faith, it's already the gold of God that we're in touch with. And that's that very life of God within us, which leads us through the various stages to reach its own level of infinite awareness and brightness and love. But we already have it. So he even says gold earrings plated with silver are actually referred to in the first chapter of the song as a gift from the bridegroom. And so you would suddenly form the eyes I have desired. So it's formed there beneath the formulas because of the remarkable presence of the beloved she experiences. And I dare that sketch deep within my heart. And this verse from the Psalm says, the feathers of the dove will be silvery, and the hinder parts will be of the color of gold. So he riffs on that, silver and gold, as I just explained. So there's some interesting truths, about how faith works and what the journey of faith is, both poetically and then in the expositions that he gives. He speaks about the purification of the senses, and then long sections of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, which are never quoted, about purging the imagination, the memory, all the faculties, including the intellect, and then the night of the spirit, etc., and all of that. So those really important testimony, to show that doubt or disorientation or darkness is the life of faith. If you're not experiencing that, you're not making progress. So we're back to, the adage that I said at the beginning. If someone comes to me and says they're having doubts about faith, I say, great! But of course, you have to see exactly what they mean and, what level they're at. That moving through the darkness, is a sign of maturation, not a sign of a lack of commitment, or it can be, as John of the Cross says. If you just don't care about the life of faith and you're filled with all sorts of doubts, well, whose fault is that? But if you're actually, trying to pursue the life of faith and you find more darkness, that's actually a good sign. Any questions or comments before we move on from here? It's because you all understand John of the Cross perfectly, then.
I don't understand using the word wound in my heart.
You don't?
No. Maybe I'm very naive or simple.
Cupid? Arrow!
Okay. Because I took it as something negative.
No. Are you mad at Cupid when you're wounded with love, when your heart is pierced with ecstasy? Right, so.
Thank you.
I die because I do not die. The wound kills me and gives me life, as St. Teresa says in the poem, her poetry. Anyone else? I hope you're just intent and not falling asleep. Okay. So what about Mother Teresa? Everybody's always talking about Mother Teresa and her darkness of faith. I suggested already that all of the Teresas, particularly Teresa of Lisieux and Mother Teresa of Calcutta, but maybe also St. Teresa of Jesus, Teresa of Avila, all three of them lived within a very, very tight and narrow universe of formulas of faith. All three of them, very definitely. Maybe part of the darkness they went through was just getting over that, just as we've been saying. I'm sure a lot more was going on in each of their lives, the saints as they were, as far advanced as they were. But that is something that they had to move beyond at some point. But to introduce Karl Rahner, I thought I would. This just came into my hands a couple days ago. Apparently, it's from the front page of the bulletin of St. Church of St. Ignatius of Loyola on 84th Street, the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The associate pastor has this thing about faith and darkness. And someone brought copies of it into our church and said, great, I'll use it on Tuesday. This is a really interesting story. Maybe you saw it already. In one of his columns in American Magazine a few years ago, Father John Kavanaugh wrote of the time he spent in Calcutta working with Mother Teresa in her hospice for the dying. On his first morning there, he met Mother Teresa and she asked him what she could do for him. Please pray that I have clarity, he told her. To his surprise, she answered no. She wouldn't pray for that. When he asked her why, she told him that clarity was the last thing he was clinging to. And he had to let go of it. But you always seem to have the clarity I long for, he told her. And she laughed. I've never had clarity, she said. What I've always had is faith. So I will pray that you have faith. Wow. That tells you something. So often you hear people speak about, very glibly about, well, faith is certitude, faith is clarity, and Mother Teresa is saying, no, it's the opposite of faith. If you have clarity, then you're not living the life of faith. Basically is what she's saying. Both because the object of faith is infinite, and because, we're struggling along the way. We're going through step by step. So, John Kavanaugh says that at that moment, Mother Teresa became for him one of the heroes of faith, like Abraham and Mary. People who live by faith not knowing exactly what the future will bring. Whereas Hebrews, that same chapter of Hebrews, when it talks about faith, speaks about the example of Abraham that left his homeland not knowing where he was going, just because God told him to. God didn't say, okay, here's the map, and this is where you're going to wind up, no worries, he just go. Didn't know where he was going. He went as a pilgrim through the promised land, with no lasting city pilgrims and wayfarers in this world, which is what we are. So clarity? Not until the divine clarity of midday, in the vision of God. It's then, by the way. Because if we understood God completely, then we'd be God completely. Right. So this is, interestingly enough, this is I have another book of Karl Rahner called The Foundations of Christian Faith, which is really, really deeply theological, and I wouldn't recommend it, because he's not easy to read, as you probably know if you have any knowledge of Karl Rahner. On the other hand, I think I got this book from my father's library, Karl Rahner, The Practice of Faith, a handbook of contemporary spirituality. That's a little more approachable. It's still very heavily theological. So I'm just going to look at a couple of pages from here, which will help explain, some of the points we've made, and then I'll give a little, with the help of planting the seed that Rahner does. I'll give you a little presentation of Karl Rahner's vision of the God-man relationship, God-human relationship, which will help explain theologically this journey of faith. So, picking up on the very notion of clarity that we just heard from Mother Teresa, interestingly enough, he has at the very beginning, in chapter 1, he says, I'm well aware that words can variously sound lofty and theoretical, that they create a feeling that real life is being shrouded in a haze of fine words, but also that in their meaning they are far from clear. The vagueness of the ideals just mentioned must be admitted. All words which express or invoke the totality of human existence are unclear, because they point to the one most real, absolutely single totality which we call God. For us, however, this unclarity, quotes, has an absolutely positive and irreplaceable function. And a person who does not accept this unclarity as good and a promise drifts into trivial stupidity. So anyone who's always talking about the clarity of faith is falling into trivial stupidity in terms of the absolute mystery that we're talking about. So that fits in very well with what we were just saying. Page 7. Now this is really important. It's a major part of Karl Rahner's theology, and it fits in with the question that I was asked the first night, which I'll come back to in a second. So, the role of grace in the Spirit. Nonetheless, Christians believe that anyone who is faithful to the dictates of his or her conscience is following this intimate movement in God towards God. So in other words, grace, I would say faith, because it's this movement of trust and surrender, is given whoever makes that commitment to go out of himself or herself in a moral act, to behave in a moral way, following the dictates of conscience. Christians believe that this movement takes place even if a person does not recognize it for what it is. Holy Spirit, grace. It's really important. And this is what we used to call in theology baptism of desire. When you got grace simply by desiring to do what is good and by doing it under the impulse of the Spirit, even if you've never heard of Jesus, even if you've never even heard of God. So that's a really important point in Karl Rahner's theology, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, describing how it works, in his understanding. And again, this is on practice of faith. The simplicity of faith. The simplicity of faith. So faith should be a lived experience, as he says, not just a series of propositions, as we've been saying. That's the mystical element in it. That grace which, through this point, God's universal saving power is always and everywhere at work, The grace of ineffable, silent access to the mystery of God, communicating himself in love and forgiveness. So for Rahner, God is self-communication to us. That's the mystery of God's revelation, actually self-communicating. God doesn't reveal stuff to us. God reveals God's self to us. God's self-communication is what the mystery of the universe is really all about. And we, in Rahner's view, as he calls us, especially in this other book, we're constitutively, in other words, by our very being and constitution, hearers of the word. We're hearkening to wait for a revelation of that kind. And we are the place, or how does he put it? Humans as the event of God's free and forgiving self-communication. So we're actually made, constituted to be the receptor of that. It's in our very DNA to be open to God and to be surrendering to God, who self-communicates to us and we communicate back. So that's why any human being, not just a Christian, that's where he gets the phrase, you might have heard it, anonymous Christian, someone who never even heard of Christ, but nonetheless lives this life in the everyday experience of following his conscience, or her conscience, is a Christian without knowing it. And we've abandoned that way of speaking because it tends to be a little too centered on Christian vocabulary. We're trying to respect other people's worlds, but you can see what he's getting at. That all human beings, and this is very Zen, very Eastern as well, the notion that God is at work, or the Absolute is at work, infinity is at work right here and now in every person's life. So if you want to say, well, I'm not sure I believe that I have faith, well, don't forget, faith is just a surrender to whatever higher power, and if you're living a moral life, you probably do have it, although you don't call it that. For this grace will then be seen to be the grace which, even unconsciously, we truly experience. So, unconsciously, we truly experience. The grace which, through God's universal saving power, is always and everywhere at work. As I said, the grace of ineffable silent access to the mystery of God, communicating himself in love and forgiveness. And this experience of grace, this indefinable mysticism of everyday life, I like that phrase, the mysticism of everyday life, will be seen to be the essence of Christianity. That's what it is all about. Explicit or implicit. And therefore one of the starting points of fundamental theology, another book that we're talking about. And if this experience is deliberately and consciously invoked, our conceptual and institutional Christianity, which of course is and remains something essential, will for the first time be realized in its true simplicity and unity. This is the crucial thing that's going on in Christians' lives and anybody's lives. So we're getting more into the metaphysics of what a human being is in this, and we're going to elaborate on that a little more in a second. And finally, here, the certitude of faith. This goes back to what we saw in John of the Cross about the gold and the silver. We already have the reality underneath the concepts. We're already living it. We're already living the life of God, and following our conscience, whatever it is. That's where the certainty comes from. It's an existential certitude, which comes from a loving trust and surrender to someone, a reality we get to know more and more, the beloved, the bridegroom, etc. So it's a lived experience. It's not a certitude that's intellectual. Oh, that sounds reasonable. God is Trinity, Jesus is incarnate. That's a formula I can believe in. That's a creator. No, that'll never be enough. That'll never be what it's about. That's the concepts we have to go beyond in our journey of faith, even though using them as stepping stones along the way, in many cases. But as he explains, the certitude comes from that gift of God that we actually experience in us, which is the faith itself, which is the active, and which is love, and which is the life with God. So it's not just subjective, as you see, and it's totally objective in the sense that really God is really at work, and he makes a particular point of that. And he agrees here with Fowler in the sense that anyone who doesn't have any experience of this kind of trust, is basically copying out of existence entirely. Everybody tries something. So it's not that strange a thing to imagine ourselves really surrendering to a higher goal or a higher truth, a higher reality, which is ultimately experienced as personal. Now, the last section I want to read here it will be a prelude to just a quick philosophical explanation of where Rahner is coming from, and we'll make it, hope even clearer how that fits into the schema of the growth of faith and the journey of faith. This is vision of humanity as being intrinsically transcendental. We have an orientation intrinsically towards the transcendental. He even calls it a supernatural existential, but we'll go into an explanation of that. But we are intrinsically geared to transcendent above us, and I'll explain that more in a minute. But here's what he says. A person understands himself as the one who reaches out beyond the conceptual into the nameless and the incomprehensible. That's his vision of what a human being is. Transcendence grasped in its unlimited breadth is the a priori condition of objective and reflective knowledge. So anything we know objectively, and any lesser knowledge that we have of things, is always against the background and in the light of this transcendental orientation. It is the very condition of its possibility, even though it is ordered to be inexpressible. It's also the precondition for the freedom which is historically expressed and objectified, because we have this vast infinite background against which to make our choices. Thus, the experience of the nameless mystery is both origin and goal, alpha and omega, is the a priori condition of all categorical knowledge, and I'll explain that in a second, and all historical activity. It is not merely a marginal phenomenon at the end of the road. Otherwise, it would merely be a matter of a journey into the bright light of categorical and scientific understanding, a journey on which a man grows weary in the pursuit of knowledge, leaves what is still unknown to itself, and gives the name of mystery to this unmastered realm of the intelligible. In contrast, knowledge in the primary sense is the presence of the mystery itself. It is being addressed by what no longer has a name. It is relying on a reality which is not mastered, but is itself the master. God, in other words. It is the speech of the being without a name. And in the Kabbalah, you might know that the ultimate name of God is nothing. I keep liking to remind people of that. Beyond the the Tetragrammaton and the ineffable names of God, which are already ineffable, you have Ayin, which means nothing. God is nothing. So, no longer has a name. It's relying on a reality which is not mastered, but is itself the master. It is the speech of the being without a name, about which clear statements are impossible. In the end, clear statements are impossible, literally impossible. It is the last moment before the dumbness which is needed if the silence is to be heard. Dumbness in the sense of not speaking. Which is needed if the silence is to be heard and God is to be worshipped in love. So, Rahner, for all his dense German theologizing, is quite a spiritual writer and really a mystical writer. I think he had very deep spiritual experience to be able to write this way. But his philosophy of man, humanity, he always used, sexist language back in the 50s. And this is where it gets a little complicated, but I'll just try and explain it. Some of you may be very much aware of it, but his philosophical approach is Heideggerian and also what's called transcendental Thomism, which means that humanity and all its faculties, have the spiritual, not just the bodily and the passions and all that, but the intellect and will and the spiritual side. But what makes it transcendental is as you just heard. As you just heard, it's oriented intrinsically and constitutionally toward an infinite horizon. Transcendental. Where does he get that? You could not just St. Thomas. It's an elaboration which is based on someone else's thoughts. Anybody know who? Anyone? All right, Immanuel Kant. a German 18th century philosopher, who, I mean, he's unreadable as far as I'm concerned. And I mean, he was one of these Germans that, you know, just sat down and philosophized all day. I don't know what kind of psychological state he was in, but he did have a very, it was the Copernican revolution of philosophy. In other words, just as Copernicus totally redesigned the cosmos, you know, the external world, Kant critically and definitively redesigned the interior world, when we could no longer simply say, oh, reality is exactly how I see it out there. It's called naive realism. Oh, there's nothing more, nothing less than what I see with my eyes and what I touch with my hands. The very senses that John de Cross just got finished saying you've got to be purified, because we get duped into thinking that's all reality is. So what he was saying, that's categorical knowledge. That's the phrase we just heard Rahner use. He was getting that from Kant. So what he calls categorical is categories. You know, you put things in little boxes, and you know, in terms of your judgments and your labels and everything of stuff you can see. But even the object in itself, you know, when there was a noetic, you know, there's a reality beyond which can never be grasped. So our senses can see what they're designed to see by our intrinsic, you know, self. But the reality out there is much bigger. Now we could mystically extend that not just to things or creation, but to ourselves, and above all God. So we call the transcendentals, what we affirm the reality of God and the morality, but he says those are from the critique of pure reason. Those are beyond what reason can simply say on its own. So there are realities, you know, to which we are geared, which we can affirm, but beyond reason and beyond concept. That's transcendental Thomism, when it enters into the, you know, into the domain of Thomistic philosophy. But that whole notion that above and beyond what we can conceptualize, there's a whole infinite world of what's real. Not just God, obviously, but everything. Anything, a grain of sand. And certainly ourselves, which we can never grasp by anything categorical. Anything clearly defined or enunciated. So you see how that actually, almost despite himself, Kant is opening up mystical dimensions, because he's basically saying, same thing John de Cross is saying, you've got to get way beyond, you've got to surrender all your securities about what you think you can grasp and hold on to, because the reality out there, whatever you're talking about, especially God, but not just, is way, way, way beyond anything you can grasp with your reason or your mind or your senses or anything. So whoever would have thought that Immanuel Kant and John de Cross would agree? But on that point they do. And then, you know, the history of Kant's philosophy goes through, you know, Hegel and Marx and got very complicated. But that basic insight is one which in 20th century Thomistic philosophy took seriously. School of Marischal, Joseph Marischal and others, to open up this horizon beyond what reason can grasp. So you can see in this vision of the human being as intrinsically oriented to a relationship with God, who self-communicates, and we're designed, you know, we're the event of God's self-communication and forgiveness. We're on the lookout, as he says, you know, for a transcendental revelation, for the self-communication of God. He actually uses the phrase absolute savior. We're waiting for someone to self-communicate because we're made for it. We look around and see what the testimony of history is. We discover Jesus, and we learn, not just through, you know, through the surrender and through experience, oh, well, this is what I'm looking for. This is the infinite communicating itself, you know, through Jesus of Nazareth, and I'm sharing in that life, and I'm made for that, you know. And so I entrust myself to that. But it's going to be a long journey into that infinity of who God is, who's self-communicating. That depths of that infinite God who's there. Not just out there, but in here, in the depths. So, you know, he says he even sees the correspondence between Christ, the humanity of Christ, and us, that Christ is transcendental anthropology. It's humanity geared for God, brought to its highest degree. And we're categorical Christology, practically. We're categorical theology. We're what happens when God externalizes itself and God's self and communicates itself to us. So there's a correspondence, there's a fittingness. We fit together. We're made for each other. But nonetheless, that's going to be a huge journey entering into that infinity for which we're made. That transcendental dimension that we're called to. So, whether it's Rahner or whether it's John of the Cross, you can see how what Fowler was saying about having to pass through stages, you know, letting go of our certitudes at certain levels of conceptual formulation, it makes perfect sense in a whole different approach, whether it's John of the Cross or Karl in this case. So you see what I'm getting at? Any questions? I can't explain all of Karl Rahner's theology. Probably can't. I'm just, you know, even if I wanted to. But those are some points. And we, you know, theology has worked on this over the past several decades, but that still remains kind of a reference point. As we'll see, I'm just going to add a few extra things. But let me just ask if there are any questions or comments right now. Of course, Bill.
Yeah, it's interesting in that bulletin I mentioned to you that was at your church from St. Ignatius.
I just read it.
Yeah.
I just read it out.
Oh, you know,
it was part of the class.
Teresa talking about not clarity but faith.
Yeah, I just talked about it. Thank you. Thank you. Any other question? Is it making sense to you? Making some clarity anyway? Yes.
Could you just repeat again that? I liked, I just was writing down Christ is transcendental anthropology. I like that. But what did you say that we were again? What were the words?
We're categorical theology or Christology. In other words, we're what happens when God externalizes itself in the material world in creation.
Categorical theology or Christology?
Yeah, I forget which one he actually uses, and I'd have to check it out. But in other words, there's a correspondence between the two. Kant uses those as opposites, categorical and transcendental. Das Ding an sich, the thing in itself is what's beyond, is the transcendental, and the thing as known is what's categorical. So what's manifest and what's unmanifest. And God and we are manifest and unmanifest, you know, fit together. I mean, it's basically what we mean when we say we're created in the image of God.
But what does he mean by we're Christology?
Well, I'm not sure he uses that word, so I'd have to go back and check. But he's saying, if Christ, the eternal word, is externalized, and he does say this, if the word is externalized in creation, you get a human being. And of course, people disagree with that, especially certain schools of the church, you know, in the Catholic Church. But he does go that far. He says, when God is externalized, when God creates his image, it's a human being that results. Because we just define human beings as one who's intrinsically and constitutionally oriented towards God, in whose image we're made. So that's why there's this immediate correspondence. Why we can recognize God when God reveals God's self, because we're made for it. We're created in God's image. Yeah.
So then somebody who say is, well, for lack of a better word, an atheist who says there is nothing beyond. All I believe in is what I can see and touch and feel and hear.
Well, we were just talking about that everyone, as you said yourself the first night, you know, they should, if they engage in life at all,
right,
they have faith in something. Either it's just themselves, or science, or art, or whatever it is. And that's enough to create, you know, a space for engagement with life, and ultimately God will speak to you in that. Whether you recognize it as God or not. If in your art you pursue beauty and you pursue love and gentleness with others as a result of the beauty, well, then you're living in God. I don't care whether you call him God or not. But if anyone says, well, it's all just meaningless, I'm a cynic, I hate it, well, you've already committed existential suicide.
Well, so
And hopefully people aren't going to stay there very long.
some of your devotions like power to, like a Stalin or something.
Well, they're on the wrong path, you know. So they destroy themselves and destroy others, you know, until something happens. They get sick, or they fail, or they have a love, they fall really in love, which opens them up to something beyond that, which we can always hope for. I'll just quote one phrase from Walter Casper, a German theologian, became a cardinal, one of the more progressive cardinals. He was behind his book on mercy. It is what inspired Pope Francis to write about mercy and to make the year of mercy, Walter Casper. But he's in the line with Karl Rahner, you can see in the way he speaks. I'm just going to give one quote from him. It's called The God of Jesus Christ. And Knowledge of God and Faith, chapter 5. And so he uses the transcendental categorical vocabulary, and so he says, faith in this broad sense is not a categorical belief, not some formulation, in a certain super-rational truths. Rather, it is the fundamental choice, you know, that's the engagement, the personal engagement. It's the fundamental choice whereby the person opens himself to this dimension of divine mystery. And in terms of it, understands and encounters life, world, humanity, and history. So that's very much Rahner, really. Religious faith does not have its existence, therefore, at the level of a regional and categorical act. It is not just understanding, an act of understanding alone, or willing alone, or feeling alone. Religious faith exists at the level of a decision regarding life. A decision that embraces the whole person and all his acts. It's a kind of primordial choice, a fundamental option, you've heard that phrase perhaps. A decision on behalf of a certain understanding of reality as a whole, together with a decision to adopt a specific practical attitude to this reality. So it's the engagement of the whole person with life. As we saw a moment ago in everyday mysticism, God works in every human life at that level, not just Christians. Just a couple of final other examples. I strongly recommend Richard Rohr's latest book, The Divine Dance, The Trinity and Your Transformation. He considers it the most important book he ever wrote, and I've been reading it, and I kind of agree. This would totally transform your life, because it totally transforms your vision of God. All his work does, but this is especially eloquent, which he wrote with Mike Morell, who's actually a Protestant, but obviously a wonderful writer and insightful. But Richard Rohr is always saying that faith is not certain. You know, faith and certitude are opposites, and you can see from everything I've said tonight where he's coming from with that. And the real, as you can see, what he means when he says the real opposite of faith is not doubt but fear. So the real contrary of faith is not doubt but fear. In other words, you can see how that fits into everything you've been saying. You hold back, you fear to engage, you don't actually engage with the, as we just heard, the whole mystery of life, your life, God, whatever that is. But when you engage, when you let go, when you leap into the trust yourself with something bigger, then that's faith. However you understand it, or don't understand it. But I just want to make a couple of quotes from this book that I came across, very quick definitions of faith or comments on faith. Page 77, selfhood, so we've been talking about what our true self is, our self and how we're constituted for God. Selfhood is thus always hidden in a promising darkness. That's everything we just heard from John on the cross. Discover who we really are through the dark night of the soul, and mainly the spouse of God, in the image of God, and transformed into Christ. An opaque revelation that we can slowly allow, trust, and lend ourselves to. So this gradual revelation of who we really are in God. Allow, trust, and lend ourselves to. And then he says, this is the core of faith. That's what it's really about. So that's a good quick summation or formulation. Beyond formulation. Then, 97. The life of faith is not at all, quote, believing impossible things to be true, unquote. Actually, it is a much more vigilant path of learning how to rest in an ultimate love, how to rest in an infinite source. On a very practical level, you will then be able to trust that you are being held and guided. So that's the work of the Spirit of grace of Christ working in us. So you entrust yourself to someone. Surrender, yielding, trusting, giving, are never going to appeal to the ego, which always, by definition, wants to be in control. Even though it can't be, but pretends. We ignore such embedded wisdom at our impending peril. A few pages later, one has always come to his own truth. He doesn't want to be bothered with their own certitude. He doesn't want to be threatened with that. You surround yourself with your own conclusions. The very meaning of faith, he says, stands in stark contrast to this mindset. So if we take Jesus out of the Trinity, which is one of the things we've done in the past, it's because we then ill-define faith as a very static concept instead of a dynamic and flowing one. We're sharing the life of the Trinity, which is dynamic and flowing. You can see more about that in the book itself. And he says, rational certitude is exactly what the scriptures do not offer us. They offer us something much better, an entirely different way of knowing, an intimate relationship, a dark journey, a path where we must discover for ourselves that grace, love, mercy, and forgiveness are absolutely necessary for survival in an always and forever uncertain world. In an always and forever uncertain world. You only need enough clarity, there's clarity again, you only need enough clarity and ground to know how to live without certitude. Have the clarity not to need it. Yes, we really are saved by faith. People who live in this way never stop growing, are not easily defeated, and are frankly fun to live with, he says. Because they have this optimism, this joy, this trust in life and in being loved and being able to love. So there's just a few quotes from that book. Finally, just a few words about another Franciscan writer, Leo, who puts this whole journey of faith, this constant growth and going beyond, an evolutionary cosmic scheme based on the cosmic Christ, the Alpha and the Omega, and says if you're really living a life of faith, you're continuing, as we just heard, we're continually open to growth, to change, to ever greater and more abundant life and light and love. And that's not only our journey, or the journey of other Christians, or the journey of other human beings, but the journey of the universe. The whole universe is an evolution. Not just the whole Earth, the whole universe. Not just the whole galaxy, but the whole universe is an evolution towards, and this is where Théâtre de Chardin comes in. I'm giving a whole workshop on him in the spring in Connecticut. The Omega point, the Alpha and the Omega, we're moving towards the cosmic Christ that Paul talks about in Ephesians and Colossians. And Leo develops all this, talking about the emergent Christ, is the title of one of her books, etc. The wonderful wholeness of being, I forget the exact title. So writers like that help us to see that this ever-widening journey, beyond where we already are, into the infinite God is actually the meaning of the whole universe. Not just the meaning of Christianity, or the meaning of this planet, but the meaning of the whole universe, which is fantastic! And should really excite us and enthuse us and get us off our butts, to really live in the flow of it. The divine dance that's going on since the beginning, for 13.8 billion years or whatever, however long since the Big Bang. Probably before that, and other universes that preceded that, and the ones will come after. And we're all part of that. So, and that's my final comment too, that puts us, then we want to be missionaries. of that, not just, for our own faith formulation, our own sect, or whatever it might be, but, for the Christ who is at work in the whole universe. And we have a responsibility to that. And I quote from, I don't even know quite how you say his name, Elie Wiesel, who, went through the Holocaust, enough to make many people deny God, but as you know, also from other testimonies like Franklin and Realism, they're also made it experienced God. But when he got the Nobel Prize in 1986, he said, I express to you my deepest gratitude as one who has emerged from the kingdom of night, which you've just been talking about in a related sense in John of the Cross, but pass through the kingdom of night. We know that every moment is a moment of grace, every hour an offering. Not to share them would mean to betray them. Our lives no longer belong to us alone. They belong to all those who need us desperately. Just a reminder that when we do experience this, we have the obligation to share and to spread the good news, and evangelize in this much richer sense than is often understood. And we will want to. It won't be experienced as an obligation, a duty. Kant has a lot to say about that, by the way, duty. But it will be spontaneous, as all our life will be more and more spontaneous because it's coming from the spontaneity of God. The overflow of the Trinity, the fount leading up to life eternal. The fire coming down on the earth, etc. Whatever image you want to use. Our experience is something that we'll want to share because we'll have experienced it. And the further we go, the more it takes on this color as pure mercy, pure gift, which, from experience, we know God wants to share without calculation, without stint, with everyone and everything. I think that's the conclusion of the long book on the Trinity by Cunha. Her first name, but she says, I become more and more convinced that God wants to share God's self with every single thing in the universe. And that's what we'll experience for ourselves. Catherine de Cunha, who's unfortunately dead already, but she wrote a great book on the Trinity. So, all right, any final questions or comments?
I ask one question. Going back to the question before, that man was categorical Christology.
No, please, Google Karl Rahner and get the exact phrase, because I don't remember it.
Okay.
The point is, yes, all right.
But what I wanted to know, before that, you said God was, and he gives two words, and I didn't.
Self-communicating God's self to us.
Okay, that was my question. That's it.
Karl Rahner was, in his own day, was fighting against the idea that revelation was God revealed stuff to us. God revealed something or some truth to us. No, God revealed God's self to us. That's the point. And everything else is geared to God's self-communication to us. And we are geared constitutively to receive God's self-communication, being, as he called it, hearers of the Word by nature. The Word with a capital W, Christ himself. Okay, thank you. Now for next week, we are not meeting here because they'll be showing movies here, so the Foreign Film Festival. So I just heard a moment ago from Ellen, who's not even here now, that I've been getting this secondhand, from Xavier, Father Xavier. I didn't hear from him directly, but apparently we'll be meeting down in the Francis Room, just off the lower church.
That's nice.
And that will be big enough for us. That'll be a nice space. So that's where we'll see you next week on the 18th. And pray for me. I'm going to Syracuse tomorrow and give a lot of talks. So pray that they all go well. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week. Next week is Protestant week.
Oh, okay.
We talked about Catholics today.
Sounds like Revelation.